All right, let's open up this evening to the book of Genesis. I believe this time we are in Genesis chapter 31, looking over the last couple weeks on some of the tension between Jacob and Laban, who is now his father-in-law. But nevertheless, because of God's promise to Jacob, Laban's flocks, his wealth has been blessed. As Jacob has been, he has benefited from it. But in the process, even though Jacob has learned to work deceitfully for the effort of trying to control things, using his own wit instead of just doing what's right at all times and trusting God that he's going to take care of him, even though that's the case, we are not blind to the mistreatment that he is facing from Laban and the injustice of it. And so there's two parts really to us as human beings when it comes to this type of area. Well, we're expected to do the right thing, trust God that he's going to take care of us, and ultimately all things will work out, and to rely on trust in him and not sacrifice the right thing in an effort to control the situation. But we also understand when we relate to Jacob, that's the second part of this. We know how it feels to when someone does us injustice and mistreats us, and they're kind of provoking things and in their effort to benefit from the situation. Well, we know on a human level how we relate to how Jacob feels. But now the time has come where all of that is now past, and it's time for God to carry on the next part of Jacob's life, where he's going to take him out of that place, and now he's going to care for him in this next sort of sequence of his life. But what we're looking at is how Jacob handles it will be the point of focus here. How he goes about it. And that's a key concept for us. There's what we do, and then there's how we do it. How we handle it. So Genesis chapter 31, verse 1, it's picking up after we see the blessing that God gave Jacob. We didn't really explain that section about how they're breeding the sheep and the lambs, but that's in this chapter 31, that's going to be explained, that what God was doing for Jacob was miraculous, and that will be explained in this chapter. But verse 1 says, "Now Jacob heard that the sons of Laban were saying, 'Jacob has taken all that was our father's, and from what was our father's he has gained all this wealth.' And Jacob saw that Laban did not regard him with favor as before. Then the Lord said to Jacob, 'Return to the land of your fathers and to your kindred, and I will be with you.'" And so Laban, even though they talked about it, he's the one who wanted to keep Jacob there. And first he did it by using craftiness of his own, deceit of his own, to say, "Well, I'm not going to give you Rachel in marriage." He did that from everything we can see about the situation because he's benefiting from Jacob and to keep him 7 years extra time, more than what they agreed. But on top of that, he talked Jacob into staying, and he kept talking with him because he wants to benefit from the work that Jacob is doing. He sees that Jacob is being blessed in his work. But even after that sequence happened, well, Laban still has a problem with Jacob. And it's kind of like you meet some people and it's like, you genuinely try and you're trying to do what you can and be reasonable, and it's like, I don't know how to make this person, pleased or happy. It's beyond me. Now, it doesn't mean you give up on them or you feel negative towards them, but sometimes it's like you may try everything in your power and you just come to some points where it's not good enough. It's never quite enough. Not to say that Jacob is, an innocent lamb in this story, but we understand what's going on here. And so he no longer, even though he's the one who wanted Jacob to stay, it says that he no longer found favor in Jacob as he did before. Something's wrong again. And it appears to be the instigator of this is Laban's sons. And so it says the sons of Laban were complaining, and this is a little jealousy here perhaps. And so God speaks to Jacob in verse 3, and he says, return to the land of your fathers and your kindred, and I will be with you. Well, that was according to the plan, but there was this in-between period where Jacob was with Laban, but now God is going to carry that out. He's going to bring him back to where Jacob came from. But mind you, we keep in mind what has happened when he was there, because sometimes we have it out of our mind. But why did Jacob leave in the first place? Because his brother Esau wanted to kill him because of how he tricked him twice, right? And basically took everything that belonged to Esau, what was going to him, and Jacob used deceit of his own. So it's kind of like we have that phrase, well, what goes around comes around. Well, the Lord said, what a man sows, that also shall he reap. And we like that imagery better because it's so much accurate. Sometimes it's not something like the world is obsessed with attributing things to karma and, this sort of thing, this mysterious idea. But sometimes it's as simple as, look, I sowed this type of thing. This is the kind of seed I planted into the ground. Either it was negative or positive. And sometimes when I do those sorts of things, I'm going to get back what I put into it. And so it's kind of like Jacob has a complaint by what's going on with him, but he can't. What he can't claim is that he has not done the same thing himself, because he did it to his own brother, right? He did it, and now he's kind of seeing how that plays out to be on the other end of it. But he's going to bring him back, but the problem has not been erased. Esau is still there. Now, Jacob and Esau, and it's important to make this point because this is the age we live in, right? In 2025, let's say it this way, Jacob couldn't send Esau a text message and say, hey, we know what happened in the past, but are we good now? No, that's not possible, right? He doesn't know, is Esau still angry? Is his intention still there? What is going to happen? So we have this in the back of our mind as we move along here. But Jacob, the reason why it's important, because that's going on, and God tells him to go back. But you notice the one thing Jacob has going for him is he is still faithful to the command. He has faith that he can trust God. And God says go back, he's going to do it. And so he has his faults, but we cannot lose sight of the faith seen in Jacob here. Even though he's the easy target, we would say, out of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. But even though that's the case, that faith is still there solid. It may be conditional at times, but he has faith that he can go back there because God told him that it's going to be okay. He can trust him. So what does Jacob do? Verse 4. Now he's going to do, in a sense, what God told him to do. But the way he does it is differently. You see, there's the what. What has God told me to do, and what am I going to do? And then there's the how. This is what God has told me to do, and how am I going to do it? But what we're going to see, a valuable lesson here for us, for anyone, is sometimes, for example, sometimes God tells us what to do, and he doesn't tell us how. And it's not like there's an inference or he expects us to know how. He leaves it up to us. Other times, because of the principles God has given us throughout his word and throughout everything we know about his character, sometimes when we change the how, we change the what. In other words, God says, I told you to do this thing. Right? This is what I'm instructing you to do. Now, I've changed how I did it. In other words, I technically did what he said, but I didn't do it in a way that's pleasing to him now. Did I follow his instructions? All of a sudden, no, I haven't. when I changed the how I did it in that situation, I no longer followed his instruction. I always love the example of give someone the car keys. I think one of my instructors gave it to me. It stuck with me ever since. You give someone the car keys. Hey, can you go to the gas station and fill up my tank? It's kind of low. I'm going to be in a rush. They came back. Well, were you able to do it? And I filled up the tank. I went ahead, got you an oil change, new battery, spark plugs changed. Here's your car keys. Well, did he do it? Well, technically he did, but no, he didn't follow the instructions of that question as asked, right? And it's a similar thing. It really depends. And what we're going to see is how Jacob followed this instruction. And the way he did it, God wants us to know, changes whether or not he did what he said. Jacob is going to make how he did it completely different to where he's not going to be able to say, well, God knows I followed his instructions. He's not going to be able to say that, and God wants us to know it in the text. So let's see now what Jacob does do. In verse 4, Jacob sent and called Rachel and Leah into the field where his flock was, and said to them, I see that your father does not regard me with favor as he did before, but the God of my father has been with me. You know that I have served your father with all my strength, yet your father has cheated me and changed my wages 10 times. So that's, let's finish that off. But God did not permit him to harm me. So that's additional information. Now we're finding out we have no reason to not trust what Jacob is saying, that Laban has changed his wages 10 times. And so we really see what Laban is doing here. And it's not easy, but in verse 7, cheated me. We have that theme continued. Jacob's name was he cheats, he supplants, he's acting deceitfully. Now he's receiving that back from Laban. And really, through all this, we're going to see that this craftiness, this deceitfulness, is really not doing Jacob really the favors that he thinks it's doing him in life. But we're going to see that by the end of his life. But God did not permit him to harm me. So now verse 8, if he said, the spotted shall be your wages, then all the flock bore spotted. And if he said, the striped shall be your wages, then all the flock bore striped. Thus God has taken away the livestock of your father and given them to me. So that's how God was helping him. And so that's how the previous chapter, what had happened, is explained to us. This was a miraculous thing. See, someone might read that last chapter and say, well, how could that be happening? And the explanation is here in this chapter. And that's why I say one of the best rules to remember in Bible study, sometimes just keep reading. Because you may stop in that chapter and you're like, how do I explain this? Do I have to speculate and all this? And you may read later on in the book, and God's going to explain what happened. And so this was a miraculous thing that God was doing in order to bless Jacob. He was essentially, whenever Laban changed the wage by saying, no, you get this kind of flock. Well, that would be all of what that particular sheep, goat, or whatever, that's what it would bear. And so Jacob was, every time his wage was changed, he was reaping all the reward for it. And so this is how God was blessing him. And so verse 10, in the breeding season of the flock, I lifted up my eyes and saw in a dream that the goats had mated with the flock. The goats that mated with the flock were striped, spotted, and mottled. Then the angel of God said to me in the dream, Jacob, and I said, here I am. Now we notice this angel of God, he was there with Ishmael and Hagar, he was there with Abraham, we saw him with Isaac, and now he's here with Jacob. So I believe we're going to see, at least in the books of Moses, this angel is a specific somebody. He's the character. He's going to show up as the one at the burning bush. He's going to be the one at the crossing of the Red Sea. And so this is more than just an angel. We have to look in this setting, angel meaning messenger. And I believe, based on what Jesus says in John about who he was at the burning bush, and the statement before Abraham was, I am, we can see that Christ, before he put on flesh, was at work in communicating with a lot of these Old Testament people. That's what Jesus' claim, at least, was in John, that he was the one working with Moses and delivering promises to Abraham. Of course, it was the Father in heaven, it was his will. But many times, it was the Lord, before he put on flesh, before he became a human being, who carried a lot of these things out. And so that may be a deeper study for another time. But what God does want us to know is that this is an important character throughout the whole Old Testament, because he's going to come up again and again. He comes up with David, for instance. But right here, he's with Jacob. And the angel of God, verse 11, said to me in a dream, Jacob. And I said, here I am. And he said, lift up your eyes and see. All the goats that mate with the flock were striped, spotted, and mottled, for I have seen all that Laban is doing to you. I am the God of Bethel, where you anointed a pillar and made a vow to me. Now arise, go out from this land, and return to the land of your kindred. God reminds him, like he often reminds many people, and reminds us of the times where he has been faithful in the past. And by seeing that God has been faithful at particular times in the past to others or to ourselves, we have real good confidence. It should be a complete confidence that he will be faithful to what he promises us and says to us in the present and in the future. And so often human beings need to be reminded of it. And he brings Jacob back to that special time. And he wants him to know, I want you to remember that time. Because some time has passed, 14 years or more. And the fact is, he wants Jacob, remember that time and the promises we made to each other. And verse 14, then Rachel and Leah answered and said to him, is there any portion or inheritance left to us in our father's house? Are we not regarded by him as foreigners? For he has sold us, and he has indeed devoured our money. All the wealth that God has taken away from our father belongs to us and to our children. Now then, whatever God has said to you, do. So, again, we would almost have to assume that they made this up for some reason, but we don't really have a reason to believe that. The reason would be some sort of animosity or hostility or ill treatment in the household. And so perhaps they had received some bitterness from their own father because of this, this jealousy that has been created in this situation. And so they decide, basically they're saying, we have no problem, we'll go with you, and there's not going to be any contention as far as we want to stay or we don't want to go. They're on board, but they accept what Jacob has said, but there has to be a note here we have to make in our mind. They're listening to what Jacob said about what God told them to do. But who are they contributing the success to? Because we don't know a ton of information about these individuals, right? We only have what's been given to us. The reason why I say that is because of what's about to happen next. In other words, are they contributing that power to God, that God is blessing them and he has plans for them? It's impossible to know the specifics, but we have a hint to why something would happen next. So let's keep reading. Verse 17. So Jacob arose and set his sons and his wives on camels. He drove away all his livestock, all his property that he had gained, the livestock in his possession that he had acquired in Padan Aram, to go to the land of Canaan to his father Isaac. And so evidently it's surprising. They thought Isaac was going to die back then, but it appears that Jacob seems to think, at least, that they're headed back to his father Isaac. So he's still there. But in verse 19, Laban had gone to shear his sheep, and Rachel stole her father's household gods. Now I have that one part in that verse underlined. If it was just this alone, it would be difficult to draw any conclusions. But when we go further in the story, we're going to see idols in Jacob's household by the time they were fully grown. And that is going to be during a time where some terrible things happen in his family. And it's at that moment when God will revisit him again, and Jacob finally, and he tells his sons, remove the idols from you. Get rid of them. Now, someone could say, well, what if he didn't have control over it? But see, why was he able to tell them that later on? You see, when God revisits him and he says, we're going to get there, and he's basically, you get the sense of a new beginning. He's telling Jacob, arise again in that setting. And Jacob is able to tell his household, remove the idols. But the question is, if he could do that at that moment in time, why on earth didn't he do it before? But here we see the introduction to idols into the household. Now, we don't know when it comes to these specific gods that Rachel took, these idols, because that's what the word is referring to. We don't know. Maybe Jacob got rid of those idols. We don't know what happened to those idols, those gods. But what we do know is that idolatry stayed in that household. How further down the line, how immediate, we don't know. But by the time it's much later on and the children are grown, those idols are there. Now, did Jacob engage in them? Sometimes we wish we had some of these answers. But what we do know is that Jacob, as the head of the household, allowed them. And we see a lot of problems later on in the family. But we'll get to that as we move along in Genesis. Now, verse 20, so now we know where the idols were introduced. So you might just question in your mind, was all the success attributed to Jacob's God? The true God. Or maybe Rachel was thinking, again, it's impossible to be certain, but maybe she was thinking, maybe if I take these idols, it will help my husband. Maybe she's thinking it would help Jacob, because maybe she did attribute some sort of power to them. And she thought, if I take my father's, he's wealthy. And if I take them, maybe Jacob and will be blessed. And that is attributing power to those false deities. But I think all of those people in that household should have seen that it was Jacob's God, the true God, who had blessed them, because that was the God that Jacob claimed. It wasn't the fact that Laban was wealthy and they were benefiting from him. It was the other way around. And that's what should have been observed there. But then verse 20, what does Jacob do next? Well, now this is what God is telling us in the Word. So no longer Jacob or someone else speaking. God, it's so important in this chapter because God goes out of his way to tell us this in verse 20. Because other things like this, in this story type format, it might have been left alone. It might have been left for us to, connect the dots, plug in the pieces. But God wants us to know this in verse 20, that it says there, Jacob tricked, and literally you have stole the heart of, but that's that idea of maybe betrayal, a little bit of craftiness, going behind the back. But he tricked Laban the Aramean by not telling him that he intended to flee. Because, see, a situation like that, we would almost want to think, nothing wrong there, right? Laban was using him. Laban was tricking him, taking advantage of him. God told him to flee, and he decided, I'm just going to take everything and get out of here. You see, if it's not for God in his word telling us Jacob tricked him, we may leave that up for opinion. Jacob saw it this way, Laban saw it that way. How do I see it? Got to use wisdom. But God tells us Jacob tricked him. But he didn't say anything to him. He didn't say anything. He just left. Is that a lie? Is that deceit? It's interesting because we might not jump to that conclusion ourselves. God wants us to know it's not that, in this situation, it's not that he lied to him, meaning he didn't say something to him. It's that he didn't say anything at all. See, God so often looks at things in ways that we don't look at it in that way, maybe because intention clouds our judgment, it clouds our decision making. We use our wisdom to say, this is how it should play out. And maybe this person is being difficult. And we use that wisdom and it clouds our judgment to say this would be right, this would be okay. But see, God, the reason why he's able to see it so clearly, why we know he's all-knowing, but the other thing is, God is not affected by the wrongs that people do to him. Now that's a tough one. When someone does something wrong to me, it affects what I want to do. It affects how I want to respond, how I want to handle. In fact, wouldn't you agree? That's really when I change my course. I mean, I might do something this way and go into it saying, no matter what, I'm going to handle it this way. But so often somebody's response is that moment in time that I decide to change the way I handle it. And God does this sometimes with his all knowledge. He'll change his direction. But the fact is, God never says, this person wronged me, and because of that alone, I'm going to do something back. The times when God has given consequences, the times when God has given punishment, it was because someone else would be hurt. That person, if they keep doing it, they're going to be hurt. Or he had some other plan. For example, in Numbers, which we're going to get to, people often pay attention to the punishments that God gives. But when we get to the takeaway there is in a theocracy. And there's only been one true theocracy, and that was Israel under that old covenant. But in a theocracy, you're living by God's law. Not just morally, but by the letter of the law, by what's legal. And if it spreads, you have an entire nation led astray. So much of the punishment in Numbers is there are rebellions that are happening, and purge the evil from your midst, he says. Get rid of it, or a little leaven leavens the whole lump. That's the application Paul is going to use in Corinthians. But for example, morally, with Jesus, God didn't say, there's some faithful people in the world, so I'm going to give my son. That's not what God said. You see, the world's immorality did not affect at all what God wanted to do. There is nothing that would have stopped God from giving his son to the world. No amount of violence, no amount of sin, because it was for that purpose that God gave his son. What makes us different than God is sometimes we don't respond. In other words, someone may hurt me, and God gets hurt sometimes by people, but the difference is he responds in a way to help that person because he understands that person who's hurting him, his heart, they're the one who truly needs help more than anyone, because that puts them in a dangerous situation. So many times what I'm really doing, I'm not trying to do something back to somebody or in a way that hurts them to help them. So many times it's just that I want to see them in pain. I want to execute revenge. So many times, and at times, or I just really want to get away from that person. And that's my motive. God's judgment is not clouded by what someone does to him. He may change the course of action, he may change the direction, but it's not what that person did that's going to change why he does something. He's not going to say, for example, what Jacob's saying, Laban did this, so now I'm going to handle this the wrong way. Jacob, he left because he said, I've had enough of this. And we understand where he's coming from. His wage got changed 10 times. He was kept an extra 7 years and longer. Doesn't part of you want to say, I probably would be out the door sooner, right? But God says, no, morality doesn't change. The right and the wrong doesn't change. Deceitfulness is always deceitfulness, and truth is always truth, no matter what somebody does. And you didn't tell him. And how were you deceitful? Not because you lied to him, not because you acted crafty towards him and did something to fool him. Your deceit was that you didn't say anything at all. You took off. See, we just wouldn't normally think like that, right? But what we're looking at when we see the character of God, I think what we're seeing here, and we're going to have to actually do another lesson to kind of apply this next time this is a very important principle to the church and how we operate, how we communicate. So we're going to have to do that next time. But I think for this lesson, what we learn about the character of God, the one takeaway, we see in God a character of complete honesty. Complete honesty, complete truth. The way Jesus talks about truth in John, so much of truth is connected with an honest character, meaning God has given us the truth, what is true and what is false, but it's so tied to honesty, to his character, it's kind of like you can't separate the two. I mean, you can't. And God is so honest, where he says, it's not only don't lie, it's not only do not be deceitful, it's you have to have honest communication with somebody. You see, if we were that honest, if we had the honesty of God, would we have problems? I'm not talking about here, I'm talking about everywhere. With the problems of like gossip or maybe bad intentions when talking about someone, or things get handled the wrong way and it blows up into this big thing and there's division. You see, if we had the kind of honesty of God where he says, I'm not going to lie to you, I'm not going to fool you, I'm not going to deceive you, and I'm also going to communicate with you clearly about everything. Because I would consider it deceitful if I didn't. If I didn't come out and tell you and come to you when I needed to, I would consider that dishonest. Now imagine if we all had that honesty. Imagine if we had that kind of clear communication in a gentle way. How many problems would not exist? How harmonious and peaceful would we be? So we want to look at next time on how that can be applied, because it's important, and why we should apply Old Testament principles like that to the church. We've already seen some of them. For example, some of the reasons in 2 Corinthians when he says that people should be able to see Christ in the Old Testament. Well, we'll look at some things. The Old Testament was written for our instruction. That's what Paul said on numerous occasions. The Old Testament was our guardian to bring us to Christ. When we go, what this tells us is the Old Testament was designed to lead people to him, but it's also then, it tells us that was meant for us to read and go back and say, here's the Old Testament, and now that I have the full knowledge of Christ, how can I apply this principle personally and in the church? Of course, the context will be different. We're not going to be under that law. We're not Jewish people under the law of Moses. The context will always be different, but the principle will always be applicable to us in the church and in our lives today. And we've already seen value, the complete honest character of God, and what if we had it? And next time, we don't want to overlook it. We have to see, how does that look like in the church? How does that look like in life? And we'll be able to learn some great practical things there. So that being said, we'll pick up with that next time. We want to offer an invitation tonight for anyone who has not come to Christ in baptism, but also for anyone who needs to ask for prayers and who needs to let something be known. Don't hesitate. The invitation is open, as it always is, but you may make it known as we stand and sing our invitation song.